Welcome to the Hyperpolyglot Activist, Learn Languages, Make a Difference. My name is Dr. Carlos Sierra Lopez, and we're here today to explain why nobody really speaks any language. Have you come across these type of conversations where people ask, well, so how many languages do you speak? Well, I speak 3 or 4, but it ain't that much. My sister speaks 5 or 6. She's really, really intelligent. And this year she's on to her 7th language. Nonsense. Nobody really speaks any language. Let me explain why. Now, the idea that languages are self-contained autonomous objects, as illustrated in this picture, is neither universal nor necessary. Rather, it participates from monolingual ideologies, which are beliefs about language that emerged with the European nation state, where language and national boundaries were represented as discrete and mutually reinforcing. For instance, in Spain, people speak Spanish. In France, people speak French. In England, people speak English. All of these assumptions that seem so second nature to us nowadays are actually the product of monolingual ideologies. And since then, monolingual language ideologies have been exported beyond Europe, mostly through colonialism and particularly in educational settings. This might be the most popular way of looking at languages, but it's certainly not the only one. An alternative, more accurate and fair approach is that of translanguage. According to this perspective, languages are not pre-existing, natural, and self-contained entities, but rather sociocultural constructs. Now, this means that languages, or better yet, named languages, because they are always named after the fact, cannot be defined linguistically. That is, languages cannot be defined in grammatical terms, whether lexical or structural. Now, because a named language, such as Spanish, English, Arabic, etc., cannot be defined linguistically, it is not, strictly speaking, a linguistic object. It is not something that a person speaks. So-called languages are more accurately and fairly described as groupings of idiolects, that is to say, an individual's unique variety and or use of language, from the level of the phoneme to the level of discourse. Languages are therefore groupings of idiolects of people with shared social, political, or ethnic identities that, once so grouped, are described using linguistic terms that tend to give the mistaken impression that the grouping was based on linguistic grounds in the first place, but the grouping is ultimately based on social, political, and ethnic identities. And therefore, the idea of a language itself, such as Spanish, English, Arabic, as an autonomous, discrete, self-contained entity is ultimately predicated upon sociocultural factors, not linguistic ones. So rather than examining separate languages, counting them and comparing our count to that of other people, as in I speak 3 languages, how many languages do you speak, etc., we should be looking at how individuals draw from their linguistic repertoires, meaning from their idiolects, to communicate in specific contexts. The linguistic choices adopted in this practice do not necessarily correspond to socially recognized language boundaries along the lines of quote-unquote English, quote-unquote Arabic, quote-unquote Spanish, etc., as illustrated in this image, showing overlaps between individual linguistic repertoires and named languages with fuzzy, socially determined boundaries. Now you can see here that the idiolect of this specific individual, represented in yellow, overlaps partially with these named languages, but it does not correspond to any of these. Therefore, this individual doesn't speak English or Arabic or Spanish. Rather, this individual speaks their own idiolect, and that idiolect overlaps partially in some aspects with so-called English, in some other aspects with so-called Arabic, and in yet some other lexicostructural features with so-called Spanish. So there you go. So that's why no one really speaks any language, but rather idiolects that partially overlap with what has been socially and politically sanctioned as named languages such as English, Spanish, German, French, etc. Hope this is clear, and as always, thanks for watching.